Welcome to Confessions with Cynthia, where we explore careers, relationships, and lifestyles of Homo sapiens.
Hello, I'm your host Cynthia, and today's special guest has a love of pop culture and a weakness for pastries. Please welcome Michel.
Hi, my name's Michel and I'm an expat from South Africa.
Thanks for joining us, Michel. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your birth country?
Of course, my story starts, I was born in Johannesburg, which is the financial capital in South Africa, to parents of Italian and Portuguese ancestry. I was raised and educated in Johannesburg, and I've got a Bachelor of Commerce degree and a legal degree. And strangely enough, I actually work in the construction industry, which is totally unrelated, but there you go, that's another story. As for South Africa, my country of origin, it's although it's a relatively small country compared to the vastness of Australia, it really is diverse geographically. There are deserts, forests, mountains. It's got a lot of natural beauty, very cosmopolitan, vibrant cities. It's very culturally diverse as well, a melting pot of people from all walks of life. In fact, the South African Constitution actually recognizes 11 languages as the official languages, including English and then a number of native African tongues.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I never knew that. It's such a fascinating thing to know. And I'm really surprised that you wanted to leave such a beautiful country behind. And with traveling to Australia, was it a dream destination for a holiday initially then?
I think if I look at what most of my friends knew about Australia, they'd probably associate it very superficially with kangaroos and maybe Kylie Minogue.
Yeah, maybe.
But for me, it's always been something that has a place that's captivated my imagination from its natural beauty and its diversity to the easygoing lifestyle. You know, the Aussie way of life is obviously something that's very envied around the world, I suppose, for want of a better description. And my interest was piqued when I first came to Australia when I was in uni. It was obvious, the appeal was obvious to me, and I increasingly became clear on successive holidays here that this was a place that I wanted to call home.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
And you said you were studying here, you traveled here quite a bit before you decided to actually move it permanently. What was the catalyst for actually making the decision to move to Australia and put your roots down here?
So initially my family had visited Australia to assess possible business opportunities. And although those opportunities didn't really materialize, my sister did decide to move with her family and her husband and children to Canberra about 8 years ago. And for me, I think that was the turning point where I realized that I could possibly live vicariously seeing them living out my dream. But it was the point at which I decided to visit a migration attorney and actually apply for a visa for myself.
Oh my gosh, and it's so nice to hear that you have family in Australia, because it can be such a terrifying experience to move no matter how old you are. So it's nice to know that, you know, your sister did give you that courage and you followed in her footsteps to come here. It's so wonderful. And when you got the opportunity to live here, what was the first year living and working in Sydney like?
It's quite interesting. That first year was something of what I could only describe as a honeymoon. In a number of respects, it was a literal honeymoon because I'd just gotten married in the December prior to me moving here in January 2018. So I kind of took it as an extended honeymoon, and time lost all of its usual characteristics. The only way I can say it is that first year felt like so much longer, but in the best possible way, because I felt like I was experiencing so many new things and new ways of doing things, really. So it was wonderful, you know, experiencing a city like Sydney for the first time and being able to call it home. Even now, 5 years later, I'm quite convinced that you could never be jaded about the Opera House or the view of the Harbour Bridge. So a lot of those aspects, as I say, were just the novelty of experiencing the city and the country that I lived in was wonderful. Working in Australia was an equally enjoyable experience and pleasant. I had initial apprehensions about it, of course, as I suppose anyone would. But being the multicultural city that Sydney is, I worked with a number of Australians and people from all walks of life, whether it be from Iran or Argentina. And I think that just speaks to the diversity of culture in this beautiful city. And they all treated me with friendship, and those are persisting friendships which I still have today.
Oh, it's such a beautiful answer, and I'm so glad that you can call Sydney home and that I can call you friend as well. And with all of this, did you actually experience any culture shock when you came to Australia? Because I know that South Africa and Australia have different, events and cultural events especially, but did you find anything that was particularly outstanding to you that were like, oh, this is unusual? You're listening to Confessions with Cynthia, with Michel.
I think it's possibly more just expressions and turns of phrase than the actual lifestyle. And I'm sure we'll possibly touch on this at a later point. I mean, as much as they are very different, in a lot of ways they're culturally the same. I think our passion for sport and
very competitive.
Exactly right. So beneath the surface, I think also having a shared history with an English past, helped to lessen any possible culture shock. I mean, moving to any new country is an adjustment, as you can expect. But I think just the wonder of being in a new city and having formed a close circle of friends really early on in our journey helped us to ease more comfortably into a new life.
That's so good. Yeah. And so when you were kind of putting your roots down and settling down in Sydney, did you find that the living experience was to your expectation? So
I must say the one thing that really struck me, and it was something that we had braced ourselves for, was the cost of living. The exchange rate, when we moved, the Aussie dollar was worth about 11 or 12 of our currency in South Africa, which is the rand. And if you'd asked me then whether I'd be able to even afford to eat out more than once a year, or let alone pay rent, it just seemed an insurmountable obstacle. But obviously when you're earning dollars, it becomes far more manageable. It's just that conversion it seems like a financial impossibility when you're doing the calculations.
Yeah. So now you're understanding a bit more about the currency. You're not too kind of jarred about spending a bit more money. I know that cost of living is very expensive now, but now you understand it a bit better. You feel like, oh, it's manageable, and you can go out a little bit more and enjoy yourself a little bit more.
Oh, absolutely. I think if you asked some of my friends, they'd probably say we eat out too often and go to too many concerts. But I think such is the nature of the city. There's just so much on offer that you always feel that you want to experience the best of it. And we're spoiled for choice, whether it be restaurants or cultural events. Yeah.
Absolutely agree. And did you see any similarities that Johannesburg and Sydney share in terms of cultural experiences, the way that they live, lifestyles? What did you think?
I think without making too much of a general observation about it, both cities definitely have an energy of vibrancy about them. It's not an overwhelming vibrancy like you might find in somewhere like New York, which has obviously a far larger population, but surprisingly, the population of Johannesburg and Sydney are more or less the same. So Johannesburg has about 5.6 million people, and I think we've got about 5.2 here. So in terms of size, it was very a manageable transition. The suburbs that I grew up in were very similar to a lot of the suburbs that you might find here in Sydney. So I would say it was a fairly easy transition in terms of the corresponding similarities between our two countries. Yeah.
Wonderful. And then going on the opposite end, what were the major differences that you saw?
So differences, I think, would be mostly in terms of South Africa obviously being a developing country. So as much as there are first world amenities, and I lived in a suburb, as I mentioned, much like you'd find here in Sydney, there are obviously pockets and in fact vast areas where there's a huge disparity in terms of wealth distribution. So you might find a shanty town literally adjacent to a very affluent suburb, and you did find that in Johannesburg. Unfortunately, there are also parts of Johannesburg that are quite dangerous because of gang involvement and widespread poverty. So yes, there were certainly differences where that's concerned.
And so, with understanding the differences and the similarities, did you find yourself kind of easing into being Australian a little bit more because you've had that background knowledge of Australia prior to moving here, where you had your holidays and, you studied here, so you felt like, oh, this is definitely where I want to be. I find myself really assimilating myself here.
I think you can do all the research that you want. Obviously, it's all academic until you actually set foot in a new place. I suppose, without sounding flippant about it, I mean, you could read up about life on Mars, and certainly I'm not trying to compare Australia to Mars. Thankfully, it's wonderfully, very easy to love and to enjoy. And I think there's also that willingness that I think you've mentioned to come here and to assimilate. I've always wanted to, and it's a fulfillment of a dream. So it was a very easy transition for me.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear. And you have to tell me, there must have been some funny stories whilst moving from South Africa to Australia that you need to tell us.
One of the observations that I found that I was quite humorous is just, I think, the way that we use different terminology, our slang versus Aussie slang. I mean, I don't need to tell you that Australian slang can be very colourful.
Yes.
We have, for example, I think I might have been giving directions to somebody, and for a reason which I cannot explain, we call traffic lights robots.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We do. And I must have let that slip into the conversation. And the look that I was given was, I realized that I'd obviously said something which was a bit bizarre to them. And then I had to check myself. And similarly with, reference to thongs, a thong is more typically associated with the type of underwear. Whereas here, obviously, it's footwear. So, kind of things get lost in translation sometimes. But yeah.
It does make for funny conversation.
Yeah, exactly right.
And then were there any memorable moments when you were moving from South Africa to Australia with your family or with friends? Anything that really stuck out to you, just like, I'm moving, I'm going away from my hometown country?
I think no particular moment per se with the move itself. Obviously, I mentioned earlier that my wedding was basically my final farewell party, if you will, before I moved to Australia. And I think it was a very special time in that I was able to have those closest and nearest to me around me at that special time. And it was a nice way for us to kind of segue into this new life that we were embarking on a couple of weeks later. Yeah. Another memorable moment that really stays with me is one which is just recently passed, and that was in January this year, and it was my citizenship ceremony with my partner at Town Hall, and it was an incredibly proud and moving moment for both of us. I felt it was just a culmination of a dream and really affirmed that we'd made the right choice, both of us. There was also our visit to Uluru in 2019, which stands out as an incredible moment for me. I know it's a very iconic and sacred place for a lot of people, and just to see it in person and see how its colors change from reddish brown during the day to the hues of purple at sunset was quite spectacular.
So wonderful. You're listening to Confessions with Cynthia, with Michel. Obviously, you were having the time of your life, just having a big party and coming to Australia and then having your extended honeymoon. Did you experience any difficult moments that helped you grow as a couple, as a person, moving to a new country? Because obviously, it's not an easy experience.
Absolutely. I would say one of the most difficult moments that I experienced as a partner, it obviously had a personal impact on me, was the fact that my partner is trained professionally to be a surgeon. And unfortunately, he wasn't allowed to follow his chosen profession. He was basically advised that he'd need to retrain in order to qualify. So needless to say, we had a lot of introspection, a lot of soul-searching conversations about whether he was prepared to do that. And we came to the agreement that it wasn't something that he was prepared to do. So very happily, he's now involved in lecturing, which he has a great passion for. And we were both in agreement that Australia is definitely home, and that nothing would change our decision to be here. So that, and if I may, there was also the the COVID period, which was, I feel, it was obviously isolating for a lot of people. And obviously, COVID didn't make the physical distance between ourselves and our loved ones in South Africa any further. But I think it was just that psychological sense of isolation, which was magnified, if you will, during that period.
Yeah, I really empathize, and I feel that a lot of people experience something very similar. And it's really nice and really brave of you to say that, because definitely now coming out of it and now being able to see family and traveling, I would savor the experience a lot more. And with all of that, how did you feel moving away from your friends and family then? What was your emotion?
It's obviously always going to be a daunting decision, moving away from everything that you know and hold dear. So for me, particularly coming from a continental Portuguese-based family, they're very close-knit. So I had moments where I thought, how am I going to deal with the separation? Is it going to be something that I can live with? Obviously, you do learn to do so, but the idea of leaving those long-established relationships behind does leave you apprehensive. There's a lot of history, and obviously leaving that behind does have an impact on you, yeah.
And how do you feel about it now?
I think now, looking back in retrospect, I realize that obviously every decision in life has a price, and that's not to sound callous about the fact. Obviously, I have times where I'm nostalgic for people and I miss them and so forth, but I am very grateful to say that I've managed to surround myself with a group of friends who have become my chosen family. So although it doesn't obviously substitute for your blood family, there's a lot to be said for having good friends here.
I totally agree. And when you create a safe little community for yourself and just finding those people that are like-minded, it makes everything seem less lonely. And it's really, really lovely to hear that you found people like that. I'm really happy for you.
I've been very lucky.
Yes, for sure. Even though you have such amazing friends with you and you also have your sister here with your family, do you still feel a bit homesick sometimes?
If I'm being quite honest, do not feel homesick per se for the country. I feel Australia is obviously my home and I love my life here. For me, it's more the longing sometimes, as I've mentioned, for people, loved ones, friends. Video calls and Skype calls can only do so much in terms of giving you that sense of closeness. But you certainly do feel that when you're saying goodbye to loved ones at the airport. And I don't think that ever goes away.
And what are some of the memories, the foods, the events? What is it that you miss the most?
Okay, so that's quite an easy one. It's not a dish that I would eat very often, but it is quite an enjoyable one. It's a Malay-influenced dish, which is baked. It's called bobotie. And basically, it's a spiced mincemeat, which is baked with an egg topping. It's got sultanas in it as well, so it's got that little pop of sweetness. There's also a department store in South Africa called Woolworths, which is very similar to David Jones. And they have a food section which sold the most ridiculous banoffee desserts. So those are really good. But luckily, there's a lot of South African stores here in Sydney that sell a variety of sweets and things like that make you not feel like you're too far away as far as that's concerned. So, yeah.
Oh, that's so good. So you could just literally go into a store and then have a bit of taste of home.
Absolutely. And then as far as just to your point about events or such like that I miss the most, I'd probably say going on incredible safaris is something that I miss. You know, the grandeur of the African bush and just the magnificence of the animals is something that you can't describe. And seeing them in their natural habitat, you know, I feel quite privileged that I've seen that.
Oh, it sounds like a dream that I would love to go one day. You have to take me.
Absolutely.
And for all of this, what were some of the things, like the tips and tricks you wish you knew before moving?
For me, the top one would be to be prepared to reinvent yourself. I think for a lot of migrants, I mean, I speak for myself as well, we're not necessarily able to find work in our chosen careers or our chosen area of study. So it means having to consider other skill sets and be open to other career pathways, for example. I'd also probably have explored my home country a little bit more when I was there. You tend to take for granted things that are familiar. And I suppose I probably would have explored more and seen more while I was there.
Definitely. And I would have loved to explore more in Sydney and also around Australia myself. So I totally understand where we take things for granted because it's so familiar, it's our home. But as soon as we step out of it, you know, it's like, I should have done this, right? So
exactly.
I get you. And what would be a piece of advice you'd give to people looking to move to a new country today?
Obviously, moving countries takes a lot of faith and inner strength, resilience, a number of other characteristics. But the most important one for me is that it's an intensely personal journey. So for me, it was about asking myself whether the reasons that I wanted to move would still resonate and be valid for me when I look back as an 80-year-old person, for example, and I hope that I can look back and still feel justified, and I do believe that'll be the case. The second piece of advice is to just immerse yourself, embrace the culture of the country that you're living in, because I find a lot of expats tend to bemoan the fact that they're not able to assimilate, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they don't just enjoy immersing themselves in the culture and experiencing the beauty of life. I mean, this is such a beautiful culture and a beautiful country to live in. Why would you not want to dive in?
Oh my gosh, it's so well said. And thank you for your honest and heartfelt answers. I really felt them. Well, thank you again for joining us today, Michel, and sharing part of your story with us. If you would like to find out more about Michel, you can follow him on Instagram at michel.diabru.31, and the link is available in the description. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode.